25 years ago, Shannon Vavich was sitting at a kitchen table listening to someone talk about installing a Catholic king in America. At the time, she thought it was just a weird fringe fantasy.
But then came Project 2025.
And suddenly, that fantasy didn't feel so far away.
In this episode, we talk with Shannon, Catholic mom, military spouse, and creator of The Flying Kitchen, about parenting, purity culture, and the quiet rise of theocracy.
It's a story about waking up, speaking out, and choosing love over control. Welcome to Whiplash with Maxwell Kuzma,
the show where two queer Catholics, Max and Emma, dive into the dark and twisty Catholic faith we were handed.
and the beautiful mess we're building in its place.
It's a journey of exploration, excavation, and deconstruction.
As we challenge the limited view of God we were taught,
An embrace of fully affirming, expansive Catholic faith.
no topic is off limits and no question is too big or too small.
We're in this together, figuring out how to reconcile our queerness with our Catholicism, and maybe, just maybe, even reimagine them both.
So buckle up, folks. You might experience a little whiplash, but we're here for the ride.
Let's go! Welcome to Whiplash, where we explore the twists and turns of Catholic identity and what happens when you refuse to stay in your lane.
I'm Maxwell Kuzma.
And I'm Emma Cieslik. Today's guest is someone who's been on a journey from joyful family meals to confronting Catholic monarchy conspiracies and sharing the whole ride with over 100,000 people online.
Shannon Vavich, also known as the Flying Kitchen, is a military spouse, mother of 7, and a former Opus Dei insider turned public advocate for inclusion, dignity, and justice in Catholic spaces.
She joined us to talk about what it means to raise kids amid purity culture, how far-right Catholic groups exploit empathy and community, and how her own deconstruction began with trauma, courage, curiosity, and music.
This conversation is about parenting and politics, liturgy and literal kings, and what happens when you realize that the quiet things said at someone's kitchen table 25 years ago are now actually in policy drafts like Project 2025?
Shannon's story reminds us that joy and grief are often intertwined, and that telling the truth, especially as a Catholic woman on the internet, comes with both.
Well, we are so excited to welcome Shannon Vavich to the podcast today. And to start with, Shannon, I know you have an excellent platform that you use to speak about your story, share about your different experiences with fundamentalism and critiquing authoritarianism, which is very important, especially at this current moment. But for our listeners, could you start by giving us kind of a zoomed out overview of your story?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. And I'm delighted to be here. Well, first of all, my platform is really very brand new as far as speaking about Catholicism and the divide in the Catholic Church and about politics. I just in January, all I did was bake pies and publish recipes because that was a safe place for me. And I'm a military spouse of over 30 years. My husband recently retired after 31 years. Doing the cooking work was a way for me to find safety and quiet and distance myself from the high-paced nature of his job, which was as a Marine Corps intelligence officer. And he retired as a colonel. And also, it was just a way for me to find like a flow state, a place of peace and joy, and also to cook for my 7 children, which I adore my family. And they were the greatest desire of my heart to have this big family. And I love it. My oldest is 26 and my youngest is 11. And so really the turnabout around the time of the inauguration was when I felt that I had a moral obligation to share information that I became privy to 25 years ago. And that was something I heard in the home of my recruiter. And it was regarding overthrowing democracy. And so, long story short, I was raised in a mixed faith home. And my best memories were in the Catholic Church. And so I did not have a painful experience in the Catholic Church, which at the end of my beginning story here, I will explain to you how I've discovered that is now a calling for me as somebody who is not harmed in the Catholic Church. What I can do in those spaces to create safety now for others.
Yeah.
And so, but the best times of my childhood was when my family did go to the Catholic Church, and I loved the music. I'm a musician, and you are too. Yes?
Yes.
I heard yes. Isn't that, I was giggling when I was listening to that episode of your podcast when you're like, we're in the choir. I know, you know, and so, and that's just another part of the story really, is how music was helpful in me deconstructing from the fascist far right side of the Catholic Church. And still it gave me a place of belonging in the Catholic Church, even when I left the fascist far right side, which they describe as the true real church. Right. They describe anything that is not like the far right MAGA pre-Vatican II Opus Dei style, not true Catholicism. And so being a musician and a classical vocalist enabled me to say, wait, no, I still belong here and I'm needed. And so that was a bridge for me to deconstruct and still find a place for myself where now I can advocate for others. But when it came time for me to get married, my mother was Protestant. My father was Catholic, although not practicing or, really adhering to any tenets. I decided I wanted to get married in the Catholic Church. And so my husband was raised in a religious family, and he said, okay, that sounds fine with me. And so it was in about 5 years after we got married, and this was after he had deployed multiple times and after the violent death of my brother, that we moved to a new place. We moved from Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, where my husband was stationed as a Marine and deployed out of Camp Lejeune many times. We moved to Northern Virginia, which of course I know now is a real mecca, if you will, of Opus Dei style Catholicism. And so I was quickly scooped up and recruited into this far right type of Catholicism. And we had our little daughter at the time. My husband was an up-and-coming Marine Corps intelligence officer. He was a captain at the time. And I was so wounded from trauma and so desperate for friends that I was easy pickings. And of course, I had such a beautiful experience in the Catholic Church as a child. I thought this could be the beginning of my healing over some trauma I had experienced. And of course, it was just the opposite. And I was very easily pulled in and very easily receptive to little ideas like this is the only version of Catholicism there is. And anything other than this hardline right, pre-Vatican II, Opus Dei style is fake Catholicism. And any priest is fake too. And you stay away from those. And I was raised in Oregon. And so I had a very good, actually, public education in a very liberal state. And so I do remember thinking during those years, like, what's happening to my brain? And I felt I attribute my ability to deconstruct from that far right side of the Catholic Church to my upbringing in Oregon, where while it wasn't taught in my home, inclusivity and embracing all peoples, it was taught in my school by my teachers. And, the second wave feminists who really saved so many of us. I was pulled into Opus Dei. Although it was very surreptitious, it was still very secret. My husband was being mentored by an Opus Dei priest who was also a Navy chaplain. And my husband thought, well, this is manly stuff. And so I'm not sure if I was dropped as a recruit because I was so traumatized by things, or because I asked too many questions, or because we got orders to the UK after about 6 months of this initial recruitment. So the moment that I am recalling when I said that I felt that I had a moral obligation to say something after the inauguration, this was a few months after I saw the revised version of Project 2025, after Kevin Roberts took over as the president of the Heritage Foundation. Kevin Roberts is an Opus Dei Catholic, although we don't know for sure because we know they're very secretive. Mm-hmm. But I always say, if it walks like Opus Dei and it quacks like Opus Dei, you can just guess it's Opus Dei, because
I love when you say that.
Because it takes the sting out of it, doesn't it? To think of a cute little duck,
True.
And
yes.
It was, I knew when I read in the revised version of Project 2025 that they were going to move to outlaw contraception. I thought, oh no, they've done it. And what did I know that they had done? I knew that they were moving in on their goal, which was to dismantle democracy, install a theocracy, and then in time, which would be 50 years maybe, install an evergreen leader, a Catholic evergreen leader, which would be a monarch, Catholic monarch. Because on that day, 25 years ago, I was sitting at the table of my recruiter, who I adored. And through contacts and many people contacting me now, I have realized that this ultra intimate friendships that they strike up with people is not uncommon, and especially very tender-hearted people, and sometimes even innocent to a flawed degree people. And so I was sitting at her table, and all of her little kids were around, and I adored this family. And her brother, they were lamenting about the problems of the world, and her brother said, well, we're not going to have to worry about any of this when we finally get a Catholic king. And I remember being so shocked. I think I gasped audibly. And I must have had a look of pure shock on my face. And I looked at my recruiter, my best friend, and she looked at her brother like, shh, like, you're not supposed to say that. And I didn't let it go. And I remember I kept asking and bringing it up, kind of like, so what, if Catholics are just a small percent of the population, how is that going to happen? And they said, well, we're going to just use the evangelicals and basically the hapless, uneducated masses. And I just thought that's never going to happen, because I studied the Constitution in depth in high school. I was big in speech and debate in high school. And I just thought that you would have to dismantle the checks and balances system. And I thought, well, that's never going to happen. So I really put it out of my mind. So yes, when after the inauguration, after it was clear that religion was being brought in to the federal government, I just thought it's time for me to say something. So I made my first video in January. And of course, I got a lot of people saying, well, you're crazy. I had a lot of Opus Dei people on that video saying you're crazy. But ultimately, it launched to where I am now. And I think it was about 2 weeks ago that my total social media reach surpassed 100,000.
It's incredible.
And that's just in a few months. Yeah, more than I ever had baking pies. Although I would like I would like to just go and make pies again. I didn't think that the Holy Spirit had this planned for me. And in a way I do it, of course, joyfully because of the people I meet like you. But I also do it quite sadly and grievously that this is what we must do. Mm-hmm. And so yes, that's my story in a nutshell. And you found me, and then I'm so very grateful that you feel safe with me to contact me. Mm-hmm. And I'm just so pleased to be here. So, yes.
Well, thank you again, so much for joining us and for sharing those things. I do think the inauguration, I remember, well, certainly for myself as a transgender person, there were a lot of feelings and a lot of things to process immediately because one of the very first executive orders had to do with trans people. And so there was a lot of intense emotion and a lot of anxiety in the trans community. The suicide hotlines, like the Trevor Project, their calls spiked by like at least double, if not triple. I can't remember the exact numbers right now. Mm-hmm. But I also remember it was a time when I personally was like, this is a very important time to me to like speak up because for me, I know at this point I am in my transition, like they kind of can't stop me with different laws and stuff. Like, okay, there's no surgeries allowed anymore. Well, I've already had basically the major surgeries, things like that. I have a beard. It's not going to just like stop growing. My voice is deeper now, but certainly I thought a lot about the younger generation of trans people and the impact. And I definitely remember also starting to see, I guess it's kind of like the Mr. Rogers quote of starting to see the helpers. Yeah. Like in such a scary time, I started to see people who like yourself, who had never really spoken about these types of things, like stepping up and speaking out. And especially to see people of faith in this time, I think is just so important because they're, with the Christian nationalism, with all this stuff, with the Opus Dei stuff, they're trying to like make Christianity and faith into this whole terrible controlling thing. But a few points that I wanted to go to from what you just shared. First, when you were talking about how when you moved to Virginia, where it was like a stronghold of Opus Dei people, especially with your husband's line of work, kind of like an elevated, high-paying position. I know from reading Gareth Gore's Opus that very much put a target on you guys already, because it's like, oh, here's somebody with status, here's somebody who's important and has money. And it's very interesting because I brushed up against Opus Dei in my life, and they were never really interested in me. And now, after reading Gareth's book, I know that that's for two reasons. One, we were very like lower middle class. We didn't really have like a status, the kind of status that they would be interested in. And secondly, I was very honest about like not being exactly like cisgender or heterosexual. And now after reading his book, I know that information just went right up the chain. So, they were probably like, it'd be cool if you could just be a straight woman, but you are not going to fit our profile very well. Yeah. So that was one thing I noticed. And then one other thing I wanted to say was, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Franciscan University of Steubenville.
I am.
Yeah. Okay. So I actually attended Franciscan, which usually when I tell people, they like
I
gasp,
know.
which I enjoy.
I did. When I heard that on your podcast, I went, oh, I bet there's some stories there. I'd like to hear that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, and what I specifically wanted to say is like it was at Franciscan. Now there was an Opus Dei. There are Opus Dei groups that are in Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh is only like an hour drive from Franciscan. But I think because Franciscan is like so much its own culture that like the Opus Dei influence on campus wasn't really there. So I'm not sure. There was this individual guy, and I remember that he was the first person I ever heard talk about a Catholic monarchy. And to be honest, at the time, because I was in college and I went to school with a lot of Catholic nerds who like to like get foam swords and like play and like dress up like Lord of the Rings, like
LARPing.
I really thought it was yes, LARPing, that's the word. I really thought that it was just silly at the time, but like it's when you talked about that they also were interested in the theocracy, and then of course like what we're seeing now, like there's clear evidence too. I just thought back to it and I was like, wow, like he really that's like a real thing that they like, because at the time I just thought it was silly because we were college students and we were kids, but that part really stood out to me also. Right.
Yeah, the Crusader, glorifying the Crusades is
yes,
is very common in these circles. They have catalogs of clothes and they have full companies that cater to these very far right traditionalist Catholic families, pre-Vatican II style, who are selling them not just the toys and the costumes, but the books, propaganda, the imagery.
The podcasters, the masculinity podcast.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah, it's a whole bro culture of I just call them the Crusader bros, because it wasn't long until they started showing up in my comments, and some of them were trying to be quite nice and like saying, yeah, but democracy really hasn't worked for us, and truth really can't be voted on. It needs to be revealed, and whatever sound bites they got. And, I homeschooled for 11 years. And so I used to get all the catalogs. We're talking flashcards of what to say. We're talking real programming of children to be able to spew out these like, yes, but we say, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, not thy democracy come, thy will be done. They have a way of just of doing this. And at this point, this is a whole generation of children who are now voting age. And yes, they're ready to go. And that's what I found so chilling in the comments of my videos, which really took off on Instagram first. But these Crusader bros who were acting like it was just going to be something so glamorous, like with a soundtrack, like Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
And they would be noble,
exactly.
And then a woman would really want them. Like they'd be gallant, and they're imagining a world where people are dressing in these medieval ways and mannerisms, and the intel I've been able to gather through my work has been, I think, one of the most rewarding things, because people tell me all kinds of things. And there was one woman who told me that in her town, the women would have these tea parties where they would cosplay courtesans of Catholic queens, and they would have tea parties, and they would speak in these elevated ways, and they would pass around literature and cards and pictures of certain Catholic queens that they were studying, and so it's in short, it's a whole thing. It's a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
As you were saying this, I was raised in a pretty conservative Catholic parish in Chicagoland area. And in one of those times, I was very hesitant around youth group. And I know we've talked about that on the podcast. That was because I was exposed to purity culture programming from a young age. But one thing that I know I haven't shared with Max before is that my dad and I to history lovers, especially me. My experience after the inauguration was really this deep concern around kind of the erasure of histories. As someone who works daily with the materials and the physical records of what lives on and what we're documenting, both communities of harm, but also liberatory practices and movements. But it was wild because my dad and I attended a talk about the Crusades that was going on and about Catholic history at my parish. And both of us, being history nerds, were so excited. And then we got there, and all of the sudden, it was a father and a son. The son was my age, and the father was my dad's age. We had both grown up in this parish since we were young. And it was about why the Crusades were a good thing. And I remember just sitting there with my dad, and it was very much in the time, like immediately after the purity culture retreat, kind of as I was coming up and hadn't deconstructed in college yet, where I wasn't quite sure how to balance this, because part of my brain, just as you said, was like, oh my goodness, we had dialogue about like the streets of the Holy Land covered in inches and feet of blood, like of people that were sacrificed on the virtue and the valor of like a church triumphant. And so it made me think of that. But I am really fascinated, as you said, about this Crusader bro culture. Would you mind sharing more about how gender roles is at play within Opus Dei?
Oh, it's all about gender.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone is constantly reminded of their place. And as a new mother, and also as someone who grew up in Oregon, and I felt very protective, especially of my daughter, to just dress her in like blue and neutrals. I remember I painted her room blue, and she had this yellow crib that my husband painted. And I went to the ceramics shop on base when I was pregnant with her. And I cast and painted a bunch of these little dinosaurs to put on her wall and to put on her shelves. And
I love this as a dinosaur kid.
And then she did love dinosaurs. She loved dinosaurs. And so, which was so interesting because when she was 4 or 5, I mean, she could name every single dinosaur. And that was one thing that I learned very quickly in this far right, in the Opus Dei circles, was we don't talk about dinosaurs because yes, I was shocked at that. And I was like,
This was also a part of what I came up with, and internal discussions around evolution in Catholic churches.
Oh my goodness. Yes. Dinosaurs. But everything is about knowing your role. And so as a parent who was actively trying not to do that, I was struck at the amount of correction that the parents would give their children constantly, to sit like this, to wear this, to don't speak like this. You know, boys don't do this, girls don't do this. And of course, I just thought it was strange. I didn't really internalize kind of the long-term implications of that because I was so also being love bombed so very generously. So yes, very much about gender, and the expectations of education for girls were really quite non-existent. That also, troubled me as kind of an academic myself. And so I did homeschool for 11 years, but mostly because my oldest was on the spectrum, I'm sure much like me. And I wanted to provide her with that time and space to just be who she was. And however, over time, inside these homeschooling groups, I found, as we moved from group to group, I found such a culture of mounting fear, where it was, and I started to notice in my own mind, I remember thinking, if I'm now homeschooling because I'm trying to keep my children away from other children or away from teachers, then I've lost the assignment. And so very abruptly, I was sitting in church, actually. I was sitting at Mass and up on the choir. And I was looking at all my little kids in the front pew in 2015. And it hit me like a bolt of lightning. A bolt of lightning. And I thought, I'm not doing them justice. They need to go to school. And they did. And they thrived. Never looked back. Mm-hmm. And so there really is an isolation culture and an us against them culture. And I in the end, of course, I couldn't reconcile with that. Also, I've noticed, even in my comments, that the women who are in these high control groups still, they don't know how to argue. They like, all I have to do is just go like this, like press slightly, and they just fall right over. They know how to cast shame. They know how to shame you and suggest that maybe you're just not very nice, or maybe you just don't know. But they don't know how to argue. And I find that very sad.
100%. Yeah. And it's so difficult to rationalize and have the tools that they need to deconstruct for themselves and argue within their own head against systems of belief that have been ingrained. I'm really curious.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Well, it was the same for me. I go back to that Crusader discussion of sitting there and going, I was just in AP European history this year, and we talked about like the massive death toll and this idea of the ends justifying the means for like incredible religiously motivated and justified violence.
Yeah, I've had a few comments like that too, of people are like, you don't know what you're talking about. The Crusades were about freeing Europe. And I mean, honestly, I just have to roll my eyes, and it's very sad. They really believe it.
Yeah.
And they're proud of the Crusades, and they've rewritten them. In fact, just last week, Bishop Robert Barron was speaking along these terms on the Tucker Carlson podcast.
Our nemesis, all of our collective nemesis.
I've decided he is now Sith. He has crossed over he is now Sith. In fact, I'm about doing a graphic of him with the emperor thing over his.
No, I mean, we wrote for Substack an essay called No Country for Kings, and the illustration I did for that shows him holding the crown and putting the crown towards Trump's head. I mean, and this was just after the calling the State of the Union a liturgy of democracy, because I mean, my argument was, if you can't tell the difference between a religious event and a like government event, like if you can't tell the difference between those two things, mm-hmm. you're just blurring the lines right into that theocracy.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to also be sensitive that I've so many different directions going, and we appreciate you, Shannon, bringing your wealth of experience and knowledge here. As something that I've been researching, I'm really fascinated as a mother of 7 children. How does natalism and pronatalism factor into Opus Dei circles? I think this tendency to create larger Catholic families and continue this bloodline.
Well, I have noticed a distinct tone that it is their duty, not as much a desire. Mm. And every child should be deeply desired. And when people ask me, like, should I have children? I want to say, if you can't think of anything else, if you are so deeply desiring of a child that you are always thinking, who will it be? What will she be like? What will he be like? Then yes, because you are deeply desiring a child. And so I have noticed that. Also, though, children are inherently joyful and beautiful and a blessing. And so I do think that many people who are, there is joy. There is joy there. And so there is this idea that once you have a child, of course, you will love your child. And that's very true. And so I think there's a lot of mystery in it. Is that, does the love come first? Does the love come second? But regardless, is that it is an awesome responsibility and that each child is a whole human being. And so in the thought of, and in the, the dignity of the human person, to commodify a child, to commodify family life as in numbers, I think is deeply wrong. And I have a very unique situation in that I deeply desired every child. I longed for them. And I also have a spouse who felt the same way. And I have not been alone in raising them, not at all. And also, I didn't have any health problems. I didn't even have morning sickness. Every day with them has been a deep joy for me, and they know it. They can see it, And so, when you are trying to model a society along these lines of have as many children as you can, without the deep desire to have the children, without the structures in place in society to help you care for the children. So I did live in a socialist culture, in the military culture. I did. Our healthcare was paid for. It was readily available, and for the most part, excellent. I had resources. I could hire a babysitter and do my grocery shopping by myself. I could hire an excellent babysitter. I could buy the nicest toys and the little wooden toys. And I had great privilege, not just in resources, but in emotional resources. And I had access to excellent counseling to work out trauma of my past. I had physical resources. I'm very energetic, and making them birthday cakes and cooking these big family meals is a joy for me. I don't dread it at all. I just made chicken and rice before I sat down here with you, and I was grateful. I'm like, oh, I'm so grateful. I was able to, take my daughter to the pool after school and then come home and make chicken. And I was like, wow, I'm so grateful that I have these resources in my energy level and the resources to take care of my little people and still spend time with you, still spend time on me. And so it's a very rare thing. And if anything, I like to convey that taking away all of these social safety nets, taking away people's ability to choose their family size, is not the recipe for happy children. It will cause abuse, horrendous abuse, and it grieves me endlessly to imagine that every child should be desperately wanted and cherished every minute. Every birthday cake, every story you read them should just be like, oh, I get to read this story, And so also the magic between a true love bond, which my husband and I have, is rare. And he would always read the bedtime stories. And he was so grateful to do that. After his long day at work, he would always read the bedtime stories, and not just one, but as many as they wanted. And so it's those things, that seat of goodness, that is being left out of the conversation of how society should proceed. And that's where I feel I must say something, because it is not just a formula of biological result, of biological function. Not at all. And that's when I think we do get into the church's obsession, I believe, with sex and gender, which we should all know as human beings, we far surpass this. And so that's what I think about a lot. And I see a lot that needs to be done. I really do.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I think it's one reason why Pope Francis was like kind of so wild for so many
Yeah.
people, because they were like, the Pope is just like chill with like hanging out with LGBTQ people, especially because Pope Benedict is responsible for the intrinsically disordered
Yeah.
language. And so then to have the very next Pope be like, well, who am I to judge? That was like a big shock to the system. Um, and a thing about the new Pope with Pope Leo, I feel a lot of optimism that he counters a lot of the nationalist American
Yeah.
ideas, because he is American, but he is also very aware of being the leader of a global church. And I really think that that contrast, this a lot of a lot of the things that we're talking about, there's a theme of like black and white thinking, where it's like everything is only, there's a rigid answer for everything. There's a rule for everything. There's a role for everyone. And if you divert from the role, then you're sinful or you're bad. And it just isn't reflective of reality. Like, to me, the world that I grew up in, I'm going to turn 34 next Monday. So I grew up in the 90s, and it was like all the programming and all the things that I read at the library, because I was a library kid. So I was just like at the library all the time. I just learned about like the whole world and all the diversity, and we had technology that was developing. We were able to connect to people, and it was all about like expanding our minds and like connecting to people. And so I think for me, that's one of like the biggest scary things, but also like just frustrations of how things have gone now, especially with like Trump and the the MAGA movement around Trump taking power. It's so frustrating to see that we haven't learned our lessons. Like, that's why we need the histories. That's why we need the education, because these things have happened before. Like, human nature kind of hasn't changed. Like, we have similar struggles that we have had for since humans have existed. I guess, and I would just say that that's why for me, because with my transition and with my faith, so having seen a lot of these harms and experienced things firsthand, experiencing the rejection of my immediate family, who basically were refusing to kind of follow me into my new identity. And also, there's a lot of other things that happened, but like that was kind of the main issue. I was like, well, if we go out to a restaurant together and you're referring to me as your daughter and using female pronouns about me, or if we go to any public event, like, it's just not really going to work. Like, this how I look, how I sound, this is not going to align. And so there's other aspects of that too. But for reclaiming my faith, for me, it was really about, and even like Pope Francis notwithstanding, who I did get to meet actually in October of 2024 and told him in Spanish I'm a transgender man.
Oh,
So I
wow.
did get to have that type of moment, which was really powerful. But even before that, for me, the importance was, hey, like, let's actually follow Jesus. Like, let's actually do these things. Let's get back to where we could stand side by side in choir and sing, and like, let's get back to those things that are actually affirming, that are actually
Yeah.
life-giving, loving your neighbor, helping people. Yeah, that's kind of like my feeling on that.
Well, and shouldn't it be a guide to how to be human?
Yes.
And
Yes.
there is so much more to being human than gender and sexuality. And this is where I think, in so many ways, this aspect of the church is still medieval. It is still
Mm.
medieval because, you asked me earlier about the gender roles in these Crusader bro circles. It's all about being a maiden, a maid, and being, and
Purity culture, purity
Oh.
culture, purity culture.
yeah, it is purity culture, and it's about marking somebody by their sexual status. Are you a maid? Are
Yeah.
you a maid, a mother, or a crone? And that's very unfair for every aspect of it, to attach these systems of value on what someone has chosen to do or what has been done to them. And we must remember this as well. And I remember exploring these thoughts as a teenager myself. I was not really, I didn't get much purity culture from church, because at a certain point my parents just stopped going, and I'm sure it saved me, that purity culture. But there was so much shame around sexuality. It's almost as if you couldn't breathe, because you wouldn't want to be labeled as an SLUT, or you wouldn't want to be labeled as a prude. And it was just so unfair. And it's like, aren't we at school to learn? But instead it is turned into a status of who is where on some kind of spectrum. And also, it's really no one's business. And it is about purity culture. And one thing as a parent I have absolutely, my children do not take part in youth group. No way. No way. And I have talked to them all about purity culture. And interestingly enough, my children are all very peaceful, with themselves. And nobody deserves to be examined under a microscope like that. I find that so perverse. And I do believe that it grooms a child to be groomed, because suddenly it's a part of a conversation. And I enjoy studying also Mormon culture. I've been doing that for about 25 years because I was raised around a lot of Mormon kids. And I remember that the Mormon girls were under incredible stress. And I have learned now through these podcasts, the Mormon Stories podcast, that these teenagers are brought into their bishops' offices for a face-to-face conversation on what they've done. How horrible and how humiliating and how inappropriate. That's how I feel about that.
That was definitely a weird thing for me, growing up trans and hearing a lot of that type of messaging around sex and sexuality. It was such a weird feeling, and Emma and I have talked about this before, where it's like when you're not the intended audience, because this messaging is very heterosexual. So if you're not heterosexual and you hear this intense messaging, it's a very strange feeling, because on the one hand, you feel like you're winning because, well, that doesn't apply to me. And so I'm not dealing with those temptations. I'm not going down this path or whatever. But on the other hand, it's like, okay, but then there's this purposeful rejection of the language, again, with education, like refusing the language of the gay community. Like, oh, we have to call it same-sex attraction. And you can't refer to trans people. It has to be like, well, they're dealing with gender discordance or gender dysmorphia. Like, they want to control how the language is used rather than actually using the language that the LGBTQ community uses. And that kind of also does tie into your point about children should be wanted. It's something Emma and I also talk about, is like, don't have kids if you're not willing that, or open to them being LGBTQ, because that could happen.
Yeah.
You cannot control that.
Yes. Yeah, that's parenting 101. It should be parenting 101. I remember the very moment that hit me. I was nursing my oldest daughter at this little chair I would sit at, and I would look out the window, and I just remember thinking, I love her so much. And there was a fear that crept over me, and well, what if something happened and I couldn't love her anymore? And I'm like, no, that's impossible. So I explored all the options in my mind, and I was like, okay, I'm going to have to talk to my husband. I talked to him the very next day. We have to this was back in, 1999. We have to accept that we have to love our children no matter what. And he's like, well, I don't know about that. And I'm like, now listen, because we actually bought, well, he was a Rush Limbaugh guy way, way before. He's come a long way. And and actually being in the military helped him to see the humanity in every person.
Yeah.
Because he did. And he was a very good leader. He's had all kinds of people he has worked with now and learned a lot.
That's one thing that's also frustrating about the whole warrior culture ethos thing they're trying to do now, because the military actually, and I know this because my partner was in the Coast Guard, and she told me about like all of the ways that the military did work to be inclusive and have roles for people. And so I'm tracking that, and that's why another reason why this current stuff is so frustrating too.
My husband loses his mind at all of this warrior talk. It is just so unnecessary. It's just stupid. The military has been functioning as the finest military in the world, and the inclusivity made it better. And
exactly.
And it made us better too. It made us better. And a big part of my deconstruction was the people who worked for my husband, getting to know them, having them over, and so, and that's where I have to be so grateful for the travel and the exposure I've had to so many people.
Exactly. And that's the key with the military too, is it's bringing together these people from all over different places, different experiences. And so we want to be safeguarding and honoring that, rather than like stripping away anybody and stripping titles from people, not letting trans people serve, renaming things if they are gay or part of people of color.
Exactly. And when you look at that, what the military before Hegseth did was honor the human and believe in the best of that human. And I believe the Catholic Church should do that too. Honor the human. And, really what Jesus came to do was teach us all to human better. And surely we need to be doing things like loving one another. And surely we need to be doing things like caring for the poor, rather than excluding entire populations of people from this club, which is solely meant to human better. And so that's how I think about that. Yeah.
And that's something interesting too. When I met Pope Francis in October of 2024, I went with a small group of 4 in total transgender men. One of them is my friend George White. He is from the UK, and George teaches now as a teacher at a Catholic school, the Catholic school that he grew up going to. And I just think that is a very interesting example and very important, especially to like an American audience, because in America we have this endless religious liberty thing where people who are gay get fired from Catholic schools all the time. And I just love that it's just an example where it's like he really is showing that you can be LGBTQ and Catholic, like allowing that separation between faith is here, but also like public life is real. Like we have to involve, like trans people really do exist. Like all the diversity of human experience is all here. And so I think a model like that is just really powerful. But I know Emma had another question, I think, wanting to loop back to people who are vulnerable to this kind of authoritarian stuff. Is that right, Emma?
100%. 100%. No, I'm loving this conversation. I think it's so important. And I also want to highlight, and I never want to interrupt Shannon, but what you said, I think, struck a chord with me as someone who existed through purity culture and was raised in those systems of kind of categorizing people and denoting worth based on experiences that they may or may not have had. And I think it persisted throughout my childhood, but also was a way that it was very much a way that centralized and erased queer phobia as an experience. And it was a way that it damaged and harmed young queer children by denying that queerness exists in any sense.
Yes.
I think what you speak to is really important, is that and I really loved how you mentioned that, like, purity culture is a system in which it's grooming children to be groomed, making them more vulnerable to systems of oppression, to systems of exploitation. You mentioned earlier that you yourself felt extremely vulnerable to Opus Dei in what you were experiencing at that moment, kind of moving to a new location, finding new friends, finding new community. Who do you find is the most vulnerable to Opus Dei, and how do they exploit that? But also, in the same sense, how can people protect themselves against this vulnerability and understand it?
I think the people who are most vulnerable to Opus Dei are highly empathetic people, idealistic, and desperate for love and belonging.
It also makes me think of, when you talk about Crusader culture, this idea of incel culture, of people that are so hungry during a loneliness epidemic for meaning and community.
Yeah. Yeah. It's all about belonging. And we are all, I think, hardwired towards, I think the dark side of that would be tribalism. But we are all hardwired to belong, and to belong to beloveds, whether it's, your dear circle of friends. And I don't know if you guys watch the show Friends. Have you ever seen that? My kids are actually discovering it right now. And I'm getting so much joy at watching my teenage boys just laugh so hard at Chandler and Joey. And I think one of the reasons why that show is so comforting to all of us is that because those 6 people, they belonged to each other, and they all met at Monica's kitchen, and they all met around that table. And what we see in that is, I think, so much of what we all long for, and that is people to go to in your daily life, to just be with in your daily life, in quiet or in sorrow or in happiness. And that's why I think that show has been so popular, because none of those people were particularly extraordinary in talent or success, but they were so human in their ability to be vulnerable with each other. And so people who are susceptible to be pulled into a cult, well, I think it's just anybody. I really do. In fact, I think the only people who aren't susceptible to be pulled into a cult are people who are longing to run a cult.
Oh.
And we're looking at wolves and sheep. We're looking at wolves and sheep. And so, I think anyone is susceptible to that feeling of being invited. How does that feel to be invited, to be wanted somewhere, that somebody's going to go out of their way and say, would you please come? And then when you get there, make every effort to make you feel so welcome and like you were always meant to be there. And so that's how I feel so many churches are failing, and the cults are thriving. That's how I think we need to shift that, very much so. In small communities, big communities, personal hellos, and just telling somebody, our conversation today made my day. Wouldn't we all love to hear that, instead of being brushed off because someone's busy? And so that's where I think we need to go if we really are going to save our planet and our civilization. And so that's not hard. It's not expensive. We can all do it. We really can.
Sure.
We really can.
100%. And that brings me to one of my final points, and bringing this conversation to a close. As we wrap up, Shannon, we just want to ask you, What do you think that people should know about Opus Dei? And also, how can you navigate these two things together of being gentle and empathetic to one another and with yourself, but also being knowledgeable and aware and literate about systems of exploitation at the center of Opus Dei and systems that seek to exploit people and bring them into these far right circles?
Just a small question.
Just an itty
That's
bitty
okay.
one.
It's clicking in my brain right now. Well, first of all, education is key, but also releasing yourself from the shame of thinking that you should have known better. I think so many people stay in these circles and become exploited. And
Yes, Shannon. Yes. So well said.
Because you think I should have known better. What these groups have a way of doing is making you feel so infinitely flawed that without them, life isn't really worth living. And that, of course, is wrong. And when you have taught people to deny their own instincts, and when you have taught people that exploitation is being exploited is your duty through all of these tactics they use, you have to have such a strong sense of self to get out. And that's what happens. That's how they don't get out. And they can't imagine life without it. I see very sad stories. People write to me every day. They're very sad stories, or people that they know. And many of the people who are pulled into Opus Dei, in particular the numiaries, which are the unmarried, celibate, who they take vows of chastity for the rest of their lives, and they live in Opus Dei houses. They're not paid a salary. They're kind of given room and board. But so many of the people who reach out to me basically saying, I have a friend who's in. These people have been taught for so long that why would you leave and be all alone in the world? So many of these people don't have health insurance. They don't have any way to establish any career for themselves. And so many of them are kept so busy on these little tasks they do for Opus Dei, they don't have a chance to build a business or to make any other friends. And that is the human trafficking. And it is a crime. It is a crime. And that's why this is the light that is being shown on this organization. Now, it's not just an organization that has designs to destroy democracy and install a theocracy, although they've been planning this for a long time. It is people who say, if you are not going to procreate, you might as well be working for us. And that's the chilling bit. They are reduced to their usefulness to, quote, Christendom. If you're not going to populate Christendom, you might as well be working for us as an unpaid servant. And that makes me furious, absolutely furious, because every human being deserves much more than to be categorized in that way and then exploited. But they do the same thing to families too. You are meant to repopulate Christendom. You are meant to have as many children as you can to create vocations. So your children will go into the church as clerics, religious priests. Yes, that's exploitation too.
I also, I've heard you speak before, and I think this might be like a good place to end. I've heard you speak before about how we need to be speaking up, and it is very scary. And so, like, how do we balance that, and how do we also take care of ourselves? Like, how do we survive this kind of crazy, scary time with our sanity intact? Like, what are some of the strategies that you use in your daily life, the things that you focus on in that kind of self-care way?
Well, I started developing really fine-tuned self-care routines years and years and years ago. And I make a point to look for beauty. I make a point to look at every bird that flies by and wonder, what kind of bird is that? Where is it going? You know? And how grateful I am that there are birds in the sky. It's like a zoo everywhere you go.
Mm-hmm.
And being grateful for the vast amount of art and literature and music around us as a musician, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we can take that for granted. I think a lot of people do. When I watch a movie, I think, wow, the effort that was made. My family and I have pizza movie night every Friday. And I always Google the actors and I tell the kids, oh, this is what this person's doing now. And this is what this person's doing now. Because I want to humanize these actors for them. But also it's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
That's so hard work that they do. The first few months after this all went down, I was in a state of utter shock. And I remember there's a plant behind me. And I remember the day I bought that plant because it was about 2 months in. And I thought, oh, look, I bought a plant. I was so proud of myself because I was just in such turmoil. And over time, I have gotten those good little self-care practices back. I take walks. I have my little rescue dogs, plants. I love plants. Anything that makes you stop and marvel at the beauty and mystery of the world is worthwhile. Anything, but also the connections with other people who are of kind heart, because that is the same relationship you will have with a good piece of music or a beautiful plant that you've nurtured. And there's so much tenderness in humanity. There's so much goodness in humanity if we would just stop to see it. There was once I shattered my leg about 5 years ago in a hiking accident. And I remember being on a gurney in the hallway of the hospital. They were taking me in for x-rays or something. And this is a German hospital. And at the time, I didn't speak German at all. I don't speak it well now, but especially then. And I was laying in that hallway, laying in that bed. And there was a man across from me also in the hallway, an older man. And, you know, in those moments where you see a person who is forgotten too, it is so important when you hear that whispering in your ear of wave to that person. You must, because I believe that's the Holy Spirit telling you to. Mm-hmm. And so I did. And in Germany, that's an odd thing to do. And I waved, and he looked at me like, thank you. And he waved back. You know, those tiny exchanges of tenderness and humanity of saying, I see you.
Yeah.
I believe that's what we're meant to do. And that's how we go on. We go on by digging deep and becoming more human than we ever thought we could. That's how we do this. Mm.
I keep thinking about how Shannon describes Opus Dei not as something only overtly coercive, but as something that recruits through belonging, through empathy. That's what makes it so dangerous and so hard to leave.
Yeah, it's not just ideology, it's attachment, community, ritual. Those are the poles. And when you're trying to be a good parent, a good spouse, a good Catholic, you're vulnerable to anyone who promises certainty.
And especially when they promise you a role to play, a box to fit into, whether that's about gender or motherhood or being on the right side of some imagined battle between real and fake Catholics.
What Shannon shows so clearly is that these structures don't collapse because of one dramatic event. They fall apart when all of us start paying attention. We start remembering. We start cooking something new at our own tables. We say this a lot on Whiplash, but it's worth repeating. Being Catholic doesn't mean staying silent when the institution kind of goes off the rails. Sometimes it means flipping the tables.
And sometimes it means building a bigger one, where everyone's invited, nobody is reduced to a number, and joy is part of our resistance.
Thank you for listening to Whiplash. If this episode sparked something in you, share it, talk about it, and keep asking the hard questions. We'll be back next week with more.
Until then, stay brave, stay curious, and take care of each other. Goodbye.